Welcome to this webinar on viewpoint diversity. And given that you have signed up for a webinar on diversity, I assume that it won't take much to convince you that diversity is very important. But I think it's still instructive to go through some of the reasons that have motivated me and Sarah to do this webinar. So I think the first point, the first thing to say about viewpoint diversity is that it's a particular form of diversity. So and I've stolen the concept of viewpoint diversity from Heterodox Academy, which is an organization in the States, which were born out of a concern for how the conversation around diversity unfolded, especially in the universities in the States. Because what they saw was that the concern for diversity seemed to shut down viewpoint diversity in the conversation around diversity. And they found that very problematic and unhelpful. And so when we talk about diversity at large, there can be different reasons why diversity is a good thing. And I think it's very important in this context to distinguish between two overall categories. So one reason diversity is important has to do with there's a social reasoning behind it, like a social fairness reasoning behind it. So this is including people who have maybe due to race or gender or something like that been excluded before. And I see I get a heart, but the next thing I'm going to say is like, this is not the diversity that we are particularly interested in this webinar. So of course it is important, it's an important aspect of diversity, but we focus on viewpoint diversity. And it's very interesting to notice that you can have a group of people who are diverse along the dimensions of gender and race and all these things, but who all believe the same things. Maybe because they all went to the same schools, or they all work in the same organization and have been indoctrinated into the organizational way of thinking about things. So when we collect groups of people that are diverse along certain dimensions, that's not a guarantee that we have viewpoint diversity. And so the other reason that organizations might be interested in diversity isn't it's not the social aspect of it, it's the performance aspect of it. So this is the idea that we need a certain level of diversity in order to make good decisions. And one of my favorite stories here is the story that about an organization in the 50s who produced mechanical calculators and believed that this was a winning strategy because it had been a winning strategy for a long time. And some of their engineers came to the management and said, "We think electronic calculators is going to be a big thing." And they'd even created some prototypes. And management said, "Nah, it's going to be a fad, right? We're not going to do that. We're going to focus on our core strength, which is producing high quality mechanical calculators." And of course, well, they died. I think they got bought up very cheap after sales had diminished drastically because, of course, nobody wanted that product anymore. Times had changed. And so that was an example of excluding viewpoint diversity that led to a very detrimental outcome for the organization. And so when we talk about viewpoint diversity, we are mainly focused on using viewpoint diversity as a way of upgrading organizational performance. That it then can have a positive impact on social dimensions, that's just the benefits, you can say. So Yes, maybe I'll hand it back to you, Sarah, and you can say a little bit about what are the conditions that need to be fulfilled to benefit from viewpoint diversity.
I will do. Thank you, Klaus. So I will come to these specific conditions that help you as a leader, as a convener of conversations, tap into viewpoint diversity in just a moment. But I'll just share that when I got interested in dialogue, it was in about the year 2000. And at the time, I was working for the British government in the UK civil service as a psychologist, and I was doing lots of recruitment and selection work. And I noticed that there was a pattern in our organisation about chasing the expert. So we were often looking for experts outside the Cabinet Office to bring them in. And I thought, actually, we've got all the intelligence amongst the civil servants and the senior civil servants. It's just we can't access it somehow, or our conversations get derailed because somebody starts dominating the airways, or other people just agree with the most senior person in the room. So this is what got me interested in dialogue. And around that time, I came across a book, and I'm going to put the title of the book in the chat for you. So there it, hopefully, oh, let me just put that in again. It's a book called The Wisdom of Crowds. And this is where these specific conditions come from. They come from this book and the research that was done. And when I read the book, one of the things that I read that really struck me was this statement that says, it's as if, as human beings, we've been programmed to be collectively smart. And this is the tapping into element, that if we're able to tap into our diversity of viewpoint, then collectively we can actually be smarter than the smartest individual in the room. That's what this book is all about, The Wisdom of Crowds. But as we all know, that tapping into is challenging. And it is not a guarantee in any way that the IQ of the whole room is going to be greater than the sum of the different IQs in the room. And that's always sort of fascinated me. How do we really leverage that? And so what I'd also observed, and have observed many times in my work as a dialogue guide, as a dialogue facilitator, is that groups can be remarkably intelligent, that decisions coming out of groups can be, as Klaus was speaking about, very effective. But there's an art to that happening. And that's where these different conditions play a part. So I'm just going to outline those, and then we're going to make these really practical for you. And so the first condition is exactly what we've been speaking about already, viewpoint diversity. So you want to have people coming into the room that have different perspectives. And of course, that can then lead to some tension, that might turn into some friction in the disagreement, but that's a good thing, that difference in perspective. So that's one of the first conditions you want. What you also want, the research tells us, is a certain degree of independence. So you want people coming, for example, from a finance background, and then you want somebody coming from the sales department, and then from marketing, or from the comms perspective, because that those different lenses and those different independent viewpoints are also going to help. You don't actually want things to get really blurred and aggregated too soon in your discussion. A third condition related to that is local knowledge. So you want people coming from their position as various subject matter experts. So decentralization is really helpful. So if I go back to my civil service context, at the Cabinet Office, we were sitting at the centre of the UK government, but we wanted to hear from the different departments, whether it was education, trade and industry, and so on. And then the final condition that you want to be thinking through to harvest viewpoint diversity is aggregation, how you actually combine the different perspectives, assuming you've actually got them in the room. And it's really important to give people as individuals time and space to gather their perspective, speak to that perspective, listen to other individuals, and then out of that diversity build a shared understanding, rather than rushing for aggregation too soon. So those are our 4 key criteria. And Claus, I'm going to hand back to you in terms of bringing some practical tools to bring that to life for us.
Thanks. Yes. So we are going to present 3 tools for how to turn this into something very practical, how to secure viewpoint diversity and make sure that you get something out of the viewpoint diversity. And so the first one is when you want to make a decision, it can be very useful to simply sit and write down a list of all the groups of people who will be affected by that decision. Both people you know will be affected and groups of people who you know will feel that they will be affected, even though you think they might not be affected. So this is a good way of ensuring the decentralization. So you make sure that you have, you will invite people who have an interest in the decision and can see it from very different viewpoints. So you can look at people from inside the organization, from different departments. You can look at the people from customers. You can look at investors, maybe. You can look at local communities. So you can look at broadly. And then once you've written out this list of what are the groups of people who have an interest in the decision, who will be impacted by the decision, you can think about, well, who can represent each of these affected groups? So you will need to pick people who are not just members of the group, but who have the knowledge to really be able to speak for the interest of the group, who has the in-depth knowledge of the perspective that relates to seeing the problem from that group's perspective. Then there are, I'll highlight a few types of people that can be very good to invite into the room. One group of people is the people who have in-depth knowledge about how to implement any decisions that are made. And I think the power of that really landed on me when I was working with a big transportation company. I was not a consultant. I was working as a manager in the customs department, and I actually didn't know much about how to clear packages with customs. But I had a bunch of people in the department who knew a lot about it. So whenever I had to go to meetings with the senior management, I thought they might ask questions about the practicalities, and I don't know anything about this, so I better bring somebody who does. And that means that in effect, I would bring people from the lowest level of the organization, people who were just sitting and making custom clearances all day. And what I observed was many times the management would discuss things and would make certain decisions, and then my employee from the customs department would put up his or her hand and say, actually, we can't do that. And management would be a bit surprised and say, why not? And they would sometimes even say, because that's illegal. So we would be breaking the law if we make this decision. And then the management would say, okay, so how do you propose we do it? And they would come up with a proposition. And many times that would just be what we would end up doing. If that person hadn't been in the room, we might have made some really problematic decisions. So I think this having people there with knowledge about the practical implementation is very important. Another group of people that I think is really important, it's not so much actually about viewpoints, it's just it's a skill that you want in the room. You want to have people in the room who are very comfortable opposing. So very comfortable flagging things that don't hang together, flagging problems, who are not people pleasers. Because by having people like that in the group, they will also give permission for other people to oppose, because they will introduce that as part of the norm in the conversation. So this is incredibly important. And of course, in different cultures, it might be even more important. Sarah and I recently worked with a lot of Asian managers, and there it's incredibly important to have something in the room, somebody in the room who can give permission to everybody else to oppose, especially oppose senior people. Then another thing, when as you review your list of people you want to invite to the room, it's very good to ensure that you have people who might be junior people in the organization, simply because they are not yet brainwashed into the organizational way of doing it. So they might come from very different backgrounds, very different organizations, and they have fresh memories of how things were done there and what kind of decisions were done, how decisions were made there. And that can really be something valuable to bring in these new perspectives. In fact, when I was hired to work in this transportation organization, one of the main reasons I was hired was that I didn't know anything about transportation, and I didn't know anything about customs, how to do customs clearance. And they knew, to their credit, they knew they needed fresh eyes. And that's one of the reasons they hired me. They thought, this guy, he knows about leadership and he knows about the other things that's important, and he doesn't know anything about our industry, so he will see things that we don't see. So yes. And then of course, when you've said junior people, you also need to say senior people. Senior people are often wonderful to have in the room, because in a sense you can regard them as representing the organizational memory. So sometimes people will be very enthusiastic about a project and say, oh, this is going to solve all our problems. And some of the senior people in the room say, we were equally enthusiastic about that 2 years ago and 4 years ago and 7 years ago. I think maybe we should consider this a bit more before we try it for a 4th or 5th or 7th time. So senior people can be very important to have in the room as well. So this is one tool to turn this the research into something very practical. Write down a list of all the groups of people who are represented by the decisions that you want to make, and select people from each group who have in-depth knowledge of the perspective of that group, ensuring that you get people on the list of invited people who have in-depth knowledge of implementation, people who are comfortable with opposing ideas, junior people, and senior people. There's probably more, but this is a good start to formulate the list of invitations and ensure that you have viewpoint diversity in the room, which you can benefit from. The second tool that I'm going to talk about is more about how to secure independence. So that was another one of the criteria. How do you secure independence so that and avoid that the opinion of maybe a single or a few people will bulldoze the opinion of everybody else. So that people can voice their opinions and their perspectives without being influenced by each other. So this is very important. And the main thing to think about when you want to secure that is power dynamics. So it's very important to say, how do we ensure independence in what people express despite the power dynamics? And you might think about, so some of the reasons power dynamics might stifle certain voices is, of course, if you have recently been hired and you're in your trial period, you can also get very easily fired. And you might think, I should hold back a bit and maybe not ruffle too many feathers. And also you might think many people, when they're recently hired, they will hold back a bit because they think, well, do I really understand things well enough to have an opinion here? And of course, the thing to say to that is, even if you might not understand things well enough, voicing your opinion can still be a valuable contribution to a dialogue. Either you voice your opinion and then you learn why your opinion actually is irrelevant or doesn't matter or misconceived, or you might be lucky and you say something that nobody thought about, and so it's valuable to bring into the conversation. Either way, whether it means that the people in the dialogue clarify why they believe what they believe, or it means that that you reveal a blind spot, both are positive outcomes for the dialogue. Another group of people, of course, would be if you imagine that you're sitting in the room and someone else in the room could potentially make your life difficult. That also means, and maybe there's conflicts, and that will also be something that stifles the conversation and have a chilling effect on whether you want to voice your opinion or not. So one of them is, rather than discussing everything in the big group, it can be very useful to discuss things in smaller group. And you can think through, how do you create those smaller groups so that the people in the groups feel more comfortable voicing their opinions, at least to the other people in the group. This can have a lot of positive effects. One of the effects is, of course, that if you go into a smaller group and you voice your opinion and you get some positive feedback from that, now you've already built a small coalition around your opinion. And maybe the person who's the new hire or in a vulnerable position for some other reason might not have to be the one voicing the opinion. Maybe somebody else from this small group discussion who might be in a more secure position can be the one to voice it. And so this is one of the advantages of using small groups. Sometimes the groups can be as small as 2 people. You can also think about when people who are lower in the hierarchy voice their opinion, you as a facilitator can lend them your authority by supporting them in voicing that opinion. So you can go in and say, well, actually, this is a really good point for these reasons. And if you get behind and support the person, that might make other people more willing to listen. So you can lend, as a facilitator, you have a authority, and you can lend that authority to people who might have less authority in the group. Another thing that you can do is to think strategically about how to use anonymity. So when Sarah and I work, sometimes what we do is that we will have individual conversations with everybody who is going to participate in the dialogue before the dialogue. And we make very clear that these conversations are confidential. And sometimes if something is said in the conversations that we would like to bring in and use as conversation starters, we can clear with that person, if I say it like this, will it be impossible to trace the information back to you? And if they say yes, we go, okay, good, we can do it like that. So it's very good to think strategically about how to use anonymity to help bring the viewpoint into the conversation. And the last thing I will say is, so Sarah was talking about thinking carefully about the process of aggregating insights. So you have the dialogue, a lot of insights are going to come up. And sometimes all of these insights, it can be a lot of information. And if you just give this to maybe the senior management, they can sort of look through it and pick out the things they agree with and forget all the rest. And then it was a bit pointless having the dialogue. So how do you ensure that the really pertinent, the really important points or that emerge through the dialogue survives the aggregation process? And one of the ways to do this is, so this is a question that I have learned from Sarah, which I'm a huge fan of. I don't know if Sarah is equally as much of a fan of it as I am. I usually bring it out. And that is the question of, if when you have had the dialogue, you can ask people to try to formulate, if this group were to speak with one voice, what would it say? To have these clear formulations of the conclusions of the dialogue helps to establish a certain level of what you call it, commitment to those conclusions, a certain level of a certain level of commitment to these conclusions, and make it more likely that they will survive the aggregation process. So this was the second tool, how to secure independence. You can work with a strategic use of group discussions, strategic use of anonymity, lending your authority to people who might not have that much authority, and making the group formulate conclusions during as a way to round off the process, and as a way of ensuring commitment to those conclusions, so they don't get lost in the aggregation process. And with this, I'll hand it back to Sarah for the third tool.
Thank you very much, Claus. And yes, I am also a fan of that question around, if this group was speaking with one voice, what would it be saying? So I'm going to cover one other approach, and it's a direct build on what Claus has been saying. And then we want to open out the discussion here, and you would be very welcome to bring your comments, your questions as well, so we can all learn from each other. But one final approach that I think is also worth integrating to leverage viewpoint diversity, and this touches on, if you've been on earlier webinars, you might have heard Claus and I speak about this notion of building a strong container for a conversation, so creating an atmosphere in the room that can take the heat, so that maybe when there is some disagreement or some conflict or some friction, or just sheer diversity of viewpoint. You know, people don't run scared from that, or they don't go back into just being polite or saying what they think needs to be said, in terms of what other people want to hear, but they have a real conversation. So I'm just going to speak a little bit to getting a strong container in the room. And I'm mindful here of a particular piece of work I did a few months ago, where it was for a large charity in the UK, not for profit, in the social care sector. And one of the great things about this meeting that they had, it was a board meeting, so there were going to be the directors and the trustees of the charity, and some of the trustees were service users. And so the CEO wanted to make absolutely sure that we were going to be hearing the voice of service users in this meeting, because they hold the local knowledge. They are, in their own way, subject matter experts. And I also discovered, in preparing for facilitating this board meeting, that along with the service user trustees would be their assistants, their advocates. So there are kind of many, many layers then to the meeting. So how do you create, in a situation like that, or in your organisation, an atmosphere that has got good amounts of safety, but it's also engaging and energising for each and every person who's in the room? And so Claus spoke earlier about having the one-to-one conversation with people beforehand, so I won't repeat more on that there. But what you might do in those one-to-ones is be listening for some specific things. And one of the things I've learned to listen for are what would be some appropriate ground rules or rules of engagements or ways of working to put in place to help people feel safe and find their voice. And going back to the example I was just speaking about, one of the ones that came to light in the one-to-one conversations was setting a ground rule that was, there are no stupid questions. No stupid questions here. To encourage everybody to be able to raise an issue or a query, no stupid questions. So ground rules can really help. I've also discovered that to access viewpoint diversity and have that strong container, it can really help to give people questions to reflect on in advance of the meeting. And this is, I think, particularly going back to personality differences. You might well be aware, whereas extroverts will often work out what they're thinking through speaking, those of us who are more introverted like to gather our thoughts before we speak. And so it can be a kindness and it can be helpful, certainly for some people with different, maybe more, who are more internal processes, you could say, to think things through before the meeting as well as during the meeting. So, you know, you might, it depends on what the focus of the meeting is, but I've asked questions like, you know, what have you felt proud of during the last year? What milestones have you achieved that you'd like to share with your colleagues? Or if it's more of a strategic session, you might ask questions like, what do you see on the horizon, for example, for the social care sector? So people's thinking process is already in motion before they even come into the room. And then the final thing I'm going to mention, and Claus has already touched on this as well, is about changing the choreography in the room. So in a board meeting, in a team meeting, you don't have to spend the whole time having whole group discussions. Claus has already spoken about going into smaller groups, and there's also a pattern that Claus and I often use in our sessions, where people go into pairs, and in that pair there's a speaker and then there's a listener with clearly defined roles. So the speaker gets to speak uninterrupted for a certain length of time, and then people swap over, so the speaker becomes the listener and vice versa. And then in that pair, people could reflect together on what they've heard, and then we come back as a whole group and we hear some of the emergent themes and observations. And that whole sequence might take you 15 minutes, 15 minutes in those thinking pairs. And that is often, especially early on in a meeting, before you do too much of the aggregation, is 15 minutes, in our experience, really well spent. You will have a lot of intelligence flowing in the room by using a simple pattern like thinking pairs. So that's, I think, enough on building a strong container, a conducive atmosphere for the conversation that will leverage the viewpoint diversity. So at this point, just going to open it up and see if there are any questions, comments, further examples that you might like to share.